The storm that saved Lee Calloway's soul arrived without warning on a Tuesday in October of 1882, sweeping down from the Wyoming mountains with the kind of fury that made even the most seasoned cattle hands reconsider their choices in life. Lee had been riding the open range between Laramie and the small settlement of Copperfield for the better part of 3 days, carrying nothing more than his saddle, a worn leather saddlebag, and a hollow feeling in his chest that had been growing steadily since the bank in Denver had turned him away for the 3rd time that year. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands roughened by a decade of fence work and cattle driving, and dark eyes that squinted naturally against the western sun, as though they had been born already suspicious of bright things. His horse, a roan gelding named Jasper, had been his most reliable companion since the age of 19, and even Jasper had begun to show signs of the weariness that comes from too many miles and not enough shelter. The clouds had gathered with uncommon speed, rolling in from the northwest like a gray army advancing over the ridge lines. Within 20 minutes of the first distant thunder, the sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind had shifted from a mild westerly breeze to something with genuine violence behind it. Hail the size of dried peas began to fall, stinging Jasper's flanks and ticking against the brim of Lee's hat like small, cold fingers demanding his attention. He had just crested a shallow rise when he spotted the farmhouse below, sitting at the edge of a shallow valley where a creek bent lazily around a stand of cottonwoods. The structure was modest, a single-story dwelling with a covered porch, and a barn set back perhaps 40 yards behind it. A light glowed warm and orange in one of the 2 windows, the kind of light that speaks directly to something ancient in the human heart when the weather outside has turned ugly and the darkness is coming down fast. Lee pulled Jasper to a stop at the top of the rise and studied the place for a long moment. He was not the sort of man who rode up to strangers' homesteads uninvited. In 1882, in Wyoming territory, such behavior could earn a man a shotgun blast before he had the chance to explain his peaceful intentions. But the hail was thickening now, and a crack of lightning split the sky somewhere over the ridge behind him, with a sound like the world itself was being torn in two. He rode down. The porch steps were old but solid, and Lee tied Jasper quickly under the shelter of a lean-to at the side of the house, where a single mule stood watching him with calm, uninvested eyes. He knocked on the front door with 3 firm raps and stepped back so that whoever was inside could see him clearly through the window without feeling ambushed. The door opened after a long moment, and the woman who appeared in the frame was not what he had expected, though he could not have said afterward exactly what he had expected. She was old, he would have guessed somewhere between 70 and 80, with white hair pinned back beneath a cotton house cap and eyes that were a remarkable shade of pale blue, still clear and sharp and entirely unafraid, despite the fact that a large, rain-soaked stranger had just knocked on her door in the middle of an increasingly violent storm. "You look like something the creek dragged up," she said. There was no meanness in it. It was simply a statement of observable fact. "Yes, ma'am," Lee said. "I apologize for the trouble. I saw your light and I was hoping I might shelter on your porch until the worst of this passes. I've got my horse in your lean-to. I hope that's all right." Didn't want to presume about the barn. She looked at him steadily for a moment, her head tilted slightly to one side in a way that reminded him of a bird deciding whether a worm was worth the effort. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Get inside," she said. "Nobody shelters on my porch when I have a perfectly good fire, and your horse is fine where he is. That lean-to held through the winter of '77 and it will hold through tonight." He stepped inside, and immediately the warmth of the place enveloped him like a blanket. It was a small interior but surprisingly comfortable, filled with the accumulated details of a long life lived in place. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, burning with a well-tended fire that crackled and shifted with authority. A rocking chair sat near it, a piece of mending left draped over the arm. The kitchen area occupied the far end of the single main room, clean and organized, with copper pots hanging from iron hooks and a cast iron stove that radiated additional heat. Shelves along one wall held more books than Ali had seen in a private home since he had passed through a pastor's house in Colorado 2 years prior. "Sit down," the woman said, moving toward the kitchen with the careful but purposeful walk of someone who has made peace with the limitations of an aging body without surrendering an inch of independence. "Have coffee. It's been on since this afternoon, but it's hot. I don't want to be any trouble, ma'am." "You said that already." She set a tin cup on the table without looking at him. "Sit down." He sat. She brought the coffee and then settled herself in the rocking chair by the fire, picking up the mending without ceremony, as though unexpected guests during mountain storms were simply a routine feature of her evenings. Outside, the storm intensified, rain now joining the hail in a downpour so heavy it turned the single window into a sheet of blurred silver. "I'm Millie Calloway," he said. "I was riding from Laramie toward Copperfield." "In this weather," she said, not quite a question. "It came on fast." "It always does." She pulled a needle through the fabric with practiced ease. "I'm Mabel Hart. I've lived on this land for 31 years. Born in Pennsylvania, came west with my husband Clarence in 1851, before Wyoming was even a territory, let alone thinking about statehood." She glanced up at him briefly. "Clarence has been gone 11 years this past February." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Thank you." She said it simply, without false modesty or theatrical grief. He was a good man, hard-working and honest and kind to animals, which tells you most of what you need to know about a person. "Do you have family, Mr. Calloway?" The question was so direct that it landed before he had prepared himself for it. "My mother passed when I was 14, he said. "Father drifted. I've got a sister in Kansas City who married a printer. We write occasionally." "And no wife?" "No, ma'am." Mabel nodded and returned to her mending. "What's in Copperfield?" Illy wrapped both hands around the warm tin cup and thought about how to answer. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley in a long, slow wave, and the fire popped sharply in response, as though startled. "Work, I'm hoping," he said eventually. "I've been doing cattle drives and fence work, but what I actually want is land, my own land." He paused, surprised at himself for saying it aloud to a stranger. "I've been trying to put together enough to make a proper bid on a section. The cattle business is changing. Smaller operations are being pushed out by the large outfits, the ones backed by Eastern money. A man who drives cattle for wages isn't going to be doing it in 10 years. Not the way things are moving." "You're right about that," Mabel said, with a precision that suggested she had thought carefully about the subject herself. "The big outfits have already bought out half the families between here and Cheyenne. Land that families homesteaded, that they broke their backs to clear and fence and farm, bought up for a fraction of its worth when times got hard." She paused, "or taken by other means when the times weren't cooperating fast enough." There was something in her voice when she said that last part, not anger exactly, but something older and denser than anger, something that had been lived with long enough to harden into fact. "Have you had trouble with the land companies?" he asked. She looked at him again, those pale blue eyes steady and appraising. "I've had trouble with a great many things, Mr. Calloway. That is the nature of living a long time. You accumulate trouble the way you accumulate everything else." Then the corner of her mouth turned up slightly, the hint of something that might have been a smile. "But I'm still here. That counts for something." "It counts for a great deal," he said, and meant it. They sat together through the storm for several hours. Mabel made supper. She insisted on it when his stomach betrayed him with an audible protest around 8 in the evening. And he ate beans and salt pork and cornbread with the gratitude of a man who had been existing on trail biscuits and creek water for the better part of a week. She ate with him at the small table, telling him about the valley as it had been when she and Clarence had arrived, the creek running clear and full, the cottonwoods young saplings, the nearest neighbor 12 miles east. She told him about the 3 children she had raised on this land, 2 sons who had gone east to seek their fortunes and written less and less frequently as the years passed, and a daughter who had died of fever at the age of 9 and whose name was Clara, and whom Mabel mentioned with a brief, soft precision that made it clear the wound was old and carefully tended. He found himself talking as well, more than he usually did, more than was his habit with strangers. He told her about his years on the cattle drives, about the landscape of Texas and New Mexico and Colorado as seen from the back of a horse in all 4 seasons. He told her about a teacher he had had briefly as a boy in Nebraska, who had given him a book of poems by Alfred Lord Tennyson, and how he still carried it in his saddlebag, worn down to a nub of its original binding. He told her about the specific feeling of watching the sun come up over the eastern plain from a ridge above the cattle, and how, on those mornings, the world seemed to make a kind of sense that it didn't at any other time. Mabel listened to all of it. She was the sort of listener who made you want to say things you hadn't known you wanted to say, attentive and quiet, with no inclination to fill silences merely because they existed. Around 10 o'clock, when the storm had settled into a steady, serious rain without the theatrical additions of hail and lightning, she rose from the table and went to the small shelf beside the fireplace where a modest collection of items sat arranged with obvious care. She lifted down a wooden box, small and dark with age, and set it on the table between them. She did not open it. She simply put her hand on it for a moment, looking at it the way people look at things they have looked at so many times that they have stopped seeing and started feeling. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I have a question for you, and I want you to think before you answer it." "All right," he said. "If a person offered you 240 acres of good Wyoming land cleared on the south field, creek access, solid barn, this house, all of it in exchange for a year's honest work, what would you say?" The silence that followed was substantial. Outside, rain drummed steadily on the roof. Jasper made a quiet sound from the lean-to, audible through the wall, and somewhere in the darkness of the valley a coyote answered something that only it could hear. "I would say," Illy replied carefully, "that I'd want to understand the full nature of the arrangement before I said yes to anything." Mabel nodded, as though this was the correct answer. "Good," she said. "That means you're not a fool." She opened the box. Inside was a document, folded carefully and clearly handled many times over the years, and beneath it, a smaller piece of paper that appeared to be a letter. Mabel took out the document and unfolded it slowly on the table between them. It was a deed. He could see the formal language even from across the table, the legal descriptions of property boundaries, the stamps and signatures. The name on it was Clarence Hart, and beneath it, Mabel Hart, and the property described was the land he was currently sitting on. "This land is mine free and clear," Mabel said. "Clarence paid it off in 1874. No liens, no mortgages, no company claims. Have the paperwork to prove it and a lawyer in Laramie who holds copies of everything." She folded her hands on the table with a quiet decisiveness. "Am 74 years old, Mr. Calloway. My eldest son, Robert, is in Philadelphia and has a wife and children and a law practice, and has not written to me in 14 months. My younger son, Thomas, is somewhere in California and may or may not still be alive. His last letter was 2 years ago and mentioned mining, which is not an occupation that improves with time. Have no one to leave this land to who will love it." Illy looked at her across the table. The firelight caught the lines of her face and made them into something ancient and readable, like a landscape scene from above. "Can manage the property still," she said, "but I cannot work it properly. There are fences needing repair in the north section. The south field wants turning if it's going to be ready for spring. The barn roof has a section that is going to fail in a hard winter. And there is something else." She paused. A man named Alden Crow has been expressing what he calls interest in purchasing this property. He has sent men to speak to me twice in the past month. They are not the kind of men who work for someone who takes no for an answer. Alden Crow, Illy said. I've heard that name. Most people in this territory have, Mabel said. He controls the Consolidated Grazing Company. He has bought or pressured or otherwise acquired 11 homesteads in this county in the past 3 years. He wants this valley because the creek is one of the reliable water sources in the region, and water in Wyoming is worth more than gold. Illy was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. And you think a hired hand would discourage him? Think a man living and working on this property, with clear legal rights established through a properly recorded arrangement, would make it considerably more complicated for anyone to pressure an old woman alone. She said it without self-pity. And I think a man who genuinely wants to build something of his own would work this land differently than someone merely collecting wages. I've lived here long enough to know what this valley needs. It needs someone who cares about it. He looked at the deed again. He looked at the woman. He thought about the 3 rejections from the Denver bank. He thought about watching the sun rise over the eastern plain and the feeling that the world made sense at those moments and nowhere else. What would the arrangement look like specifically? He asked. Mabel picked up the smaller piece of paper from the box. It was written in a careful hand. 1 year of work, she said. Genuine, complete, honest work: the fences, the fields, the barn, the daily maintenance of the property. You live in the barn quarters. There's a proper room in the back that Clarence built for a hand we had years ago. You eat at my table. You take no wages except that at the end of the year, if we are both satisfied with how things have gone, I will deed you the southern 40 acres outright and give you the right of first purchase on the remainder of the property at a price below market that we will agree upon now and put into writing. She looked at him directly. The agreement will be written and witnessed and filed in Laramie. It will be legally binding. Will not be able to change my mind, and you will not be able to walk away from your obligations without consequence. Illy sat with this for a long time. The storm continued its steady work outside. The fire burned down a little, and Mabel rose without comment to add another piece of split wood to it, moving with that careful, deliberate efficiency that he had already come to understand as simply the way she operated in the world. Why me? He asked when she returned to her seat. You don't know me. Arrived on your porch 2 hours ago. I don't know you yet, Mabel said, but I know some things. I know you knocked properly and stepped back from the door. I know you apologized for the trouble before you asked for anything. I know you put your horse in the lean-to rather than riding him straight into my barn uninvited. I know you ate what put in front of you and thanked me for it. And I know you've been riding toward Copperfield looking for work on a Tuesday in October in a storm that any sensible man would have sheltered from a day earlier, which means you've been pushing hard and probably don't have much padding between yourself and nothing. She paused. Also, you have Tennyson in your saddlebag. He laughed a genuine laugh, surprised out of him, and it filled the small, warm room in a way that seemed to startle both of them slightly. You'll want time to think it over, Mabel said. I'll take the arrangement, he said. She studied him for one more long moment. Then she nodded once with finality. Good, she said. We'll ride into Laramie at the end of the week and have it drawn up properly. In the meantime, you can start on the north fence. There's a section down near the creek that's been bothering me since August. That night, Illy laid his bedroll in the barn quarters, a tidy room with a wooden bunk, a small table, and a hook on the wall for hanging things, and lay awake listening to the rain diminish slowly into a steady drip from the eaves. He stared at the plank ceiling and thought about what he had just agreed to, turning it over carefully in his mind. It was, objectively, a strange arrangement. He was a stranger who had knocked on an old woman's door in a storm and within 3 hours had agreed to give her a year of his labor. It should have felt reckless. Instead, it felt like something clicking into place after years of being slightly misaligned. In the morning, he found out that Mabel Hart rose before dawn, had coffee ready by the time the sky began to pale in the east, and expected the people in her orbit to be functional at roughly the same hour. He also found out that she kept 4 chickens, a kitchen garden that she was bringing in for winter, and a small orchard of apple trees at the back of the property that would need serious pruning in the spring. He found out that she had an opinion about nearly everything, that her opinions were generally well-reasoned, and that she delivered them with a dry precision that was actually quite funny once you calibrated yourself to it. He started on the north fence that first morning. The damage was more extensive than a single down section. The posts had rotted along a 40-foot stretch, undermined by the seasonal flooding of the creek, and would need to come out entirely and be replaced. He dug out the first old post with a steel bar, his breath misting in the cold October air, and found a rhythm in the work that he hadn't felt in years. There was something different about working land that had a future to it. The difference between labor and investment. By the end of the first week, he had replaced the fence section, cleared the debris that had accumulated around the barn doors, and ridden into Laramie with Mabel in her wagon, where a lawyer named Henderson, a thin, precise man with spectacles, had drawn up the agreement with great care, witnessed it with 2 additional signatures, and filed copies with the county recorder's office. Lee had signed his name on the document and watched Mabel sign hers with a steady hand, and then Henderson had shaken both their hands and wished them good fortune, and they had driven back to the valley in the wagon with the late October light making long shadows across the yellow grass. "Are you satisfied?" Mabel asked at some point during the ride, watching the road ahead. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" "I wouldn't have done it if I weren't," she said. And that, he was learning, was thoroughly true of Mabel Hart. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that had its own quiet satisfaction. He worked. The days grew shorter and colder as November came on, and he spent those shortened daylight hours moving through the list of tasks the property needed. The south field turning, which was heavy work in the cold-hardened earth. The barn roof section, which he patched with new boards and tar paper sourced from the general store in the small trading community of Miller's Crossing, 8 miles east. The repairs to the kitchen garden's low fence, where a persistent something he suspected a badger had been making entry. In the evenings, he came in from the cold and ate supper with Mabel, and they talked. This was the part he had not anticipated and could not have, because it had never been part of his experience sitting across a table from someone who was genuinely interested in the full range of what he had to say, and who had things of her own to say that were worth listening to. Mabel had read widely and thought carefully about what she had read. She had opinions about the cattle industry and the railroads and the question of Wyoming statehood, and the treatment of the Arapaho and Shoshone peoples whose land the entire valley technically rested on, opinions that she stated plainly and that surprised him by their directness. "Clarence and I took this land fair and square by the law of the time," she said one November evening, while snow fell softly outside the window. "But the law of the time was made by the people who wanted the land, not by the people who were living on it before anyone else. That's not something I forget. Not many people in this territory would say that aloud," Illy said. "Not many people have the luxury of being old enough not to care what the neighbors think," she replied. He thought about that for a long time. And then he thought about the Shoshone guides he had met on a cattle drive through the Wind River country in 1879. Men who knew the land with a specificity that no map had ever captured, and who had been pushed further and further from the places their knowledge was built around, and who had watched men like Ali move through their territory with the breezy confidence of people who had never been told they didn't belong somewhere. It was a heavy thought, and he was not sure what to do with it, but he kept it. In late November, one of Alden Crow's men appeared at the property line, a heavy-set fellow on a large bay horse, who stopped at the fence and called out to Illy while he was working the south field. Illy straightened from his work and walked to the fence line with a steady, unhurried pace. "Hart property," the man called. "That's right," Illy said. "I'm looking for Mrs. Hart. Got a business matter." "Mrs. Hart isn't receiving visitors today," Illy said pleasantly. "You can send written correspondence to the property if you have something to communicate." The man looked at him with the particular assessment of someone taking stock of a potential obstacle. Illy looked back at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has spent years deciding quickly whether a situation requires action. They regarded each other for a moment across the fence line. "You work for the old woman?" the man asked. "I work this property," Illy said, which was both true and specifically chosen. The man left without further comment, but Illy noted the direction he rode and reported it to Mabel that evening. She absorbed the information without visible agitation. "That will be the second time Crow has sent someone," she said. "He'll send a third time and then he'll come himself. That's his pattern." "How do you know his pattern?" "Because the Weatherford family, 3 homesteads east of here, told me about it when they sold. And the Delacroix family told me the same thing 2 years ago when they left." A pause. "The Delacroix family had been here 18 years. Josephine Delacroix planted those apple trees you'll be pruning in the spring. She cried when she left." Mabel's voice was level, but her hands tightened briefly around her coffee cup. "Crow offered them a price that was insulting, and then he made things uncomfortable until they couldn't manage anymore and took what he offered." "He won't have the same success here," Illy said. Mabel looked at him with those clear blue eyes. "No," she said quietly. "I don't believe he will." December arrived with serious cold, and with it a change in the texture of the days that Illy hadn't anticipated. The short daylight hours and the confinement to the property created a kind of enforced closeness that was different from anything he'd experienced before. He spent more time in the main house during the worst of the cold days, helping with tasks that could be done indoors, mending equipment, working on a wooden chest that had needed a new hinge since September, reading in the evenings by the fire when the light failed too early for outdoor work. It was during these evenings that the shape of his future began to shift in ways that had nothing to do with land deeds. Mabel's neighbor to the north, a widow named Ruth Callister, had a granddaughter named Josephine who had come out from Missouri in the autumn to help Ruth through the winter. Ruth was 68 and her health had begun to decline, and Josephine had made the journey without being asked, which Mabel reported as an established fact and as evidence of good character in the same breath. He met Josephine Callister for the first time in the first week of December, when Mabel sent him north with a preserved apple gift and a letter for Ruth. He rode Jasper through the cold morning, his breath fogging and Jasper's hooves crunching through a thin skin of ice on the puddles in the road, and arrived at the Callister property to find a young woman in the yard splitting kindling, with an efficiency that suggested she had been doing it her whole life and did not find it remarkable. She was 23, he would learn later. She had brown hair pulled back beneath a knitted cap and hazel eyes that caught the pale December light and did something complicated with it, turned it warm somehow, the way certain kinds of water do with reflected sky. She was not particularly tall, but she was absolutely unself-conscious in her movements, and she turned to look at him when Jasper made a sound with the same direct attention that her grandmother's neighbor apparently brought to everything. "You must be Illy," she said, without particular surprise. "Mabel mentioned you." "She didn't mention you," he said, and then felt immediately that this had come out wrong. "I mean, she mentioned Mrs. Callister had a granddaughter coming. She didn't, I just wasn't expecting." He stopped. "I'm not usually this inarticulate." The corner of Josephine's mouth curved upward, just slightly, in a way that reminded him startlingly of Mabel. "I'd say it's a reasonable response to unexpected people," she said, and held out her hand. "Josephine Callister, Joe to most." He dismounted and shook her hand. Her grip was firm and direct. "He stayed for coffee," Ruth Callister insisted, a small and determined woman wrapped in several layers who moved carefully but with obvious pleasure at the company. He sat at Ruth's kitchen table and drank the coffee, and ate a piece of dried apple cake that Joe had made, and listened to Ruth and made polite contributions to the conversation. And through all of it, he was considerably more aware than was probably useful of the young woman sitting across the table who had already finished 2 pieces of cake, and was now reading a letter he had brought, and occasionally making small sounds of amusement or satisfaction at whatever Mabel had written. He rode home in the cold December noon with a particular awareness of having spent an hour somewhere unexpected and pleasant, and of wanting to return to that place. He did return to it. He found reasons: a borrowed tool returned, a message from Mabel, a courtesy check to see how Ruth was faring in the cold, and each time he found Joe either in the yard or in the kitchen, or once, memorably, sitting in the bare winter orchard behind the house reading a book with her coat pulled tight and a scarf wound around her neck, apparently completely content with the cold. "What are you reading?" he asked, tying Jasper to the fence. She held up the cover. It was Dickens' Bleak House, which she was apparently reading for the second time, a fact he found inexplicably endearing. "Have you read it?" she asked. "Haven't. I've got Tennyson in my bag." "Which one?" He recited from memory without quite deciding to. "Ring out the old, ring in the new, ring happy bells across the snow. The year is going, let him go. Ring out the false, ring in the true." Joe looked at him from her seat in the dead winter grass, her breath misting in the cold air. "In Memoriam," she said. "Grandmother has that one." A pause in which the cold stillness of the orchard seemed to expand. "That's not the most common passage people quote." "My teacher in Nebraska liked that one," he said. "She said it was important to grieve and then decide to go forward, that both things could be true at once." Joe considered this with the same focused quality of attention that Mabel gave things, which he suspected was not a coincidence, since Mabel had been Ruth Callister's closest neighbor for 20-some years. "She sounds like a wise woman," Joe said. "She was," he said. "She died in '74. The fever." Joe looked at him with those hazel eyes that caught light and changed it. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "A long time ago," he said, but he thought, not for the first time, that some losses stay at their original size regardless of how far you carry them. He sat down in the winter grass a few yards from her, with his back against a bare apple tree, and they talked for the better part of an hour about Dickens and Tennyson, about Missouri and Nebraska and Wyoming, about the particular quality of winter silence in different landscapes, about whether the West was what the Eastern newspapers made it out to be. She was opinionated and thoughtful and occasionally sharp in a way that was not unkind but simply precise, and she laughed at things that struck her as genuinely funny rather than laughing to smooth things over, which he found more appealing than he had a ready explanation for. Riding home that evening in the early winter dark, he realized he was looking forward to the next time he would have a reason to go north to the Callister property, and that this was a new kind of looking forward that had a different texture from the anticipation of work completed or a meal after a hard day. It sat somewhere lower in his chest, and had a warmth to it that was not entirely comfortable, because it contained within it the obvious possibility of loss. Christmas came and went quietly. Mabel invited Ruth and Joe for Christmas dinner, and Lee cooked. He turned out to have a competence with food that surprised Mabel, though it shouldn't have surprised anyone who had spent enough years feeding themselves on the trail where the alternative to learning to cook was going hungry. They ate roasted chicken and potatoes and preserved vegetables and a dried fruit pudding that Joe brought, and afterward they sat by the fire and Ruth fell asleep in the rocking chair, and Mabel pretended not to notice this and continued a conversation with Illy and Joe as though nothing had changed, with a perfect and benevolent diplomacy. He and Joe washed the dishes together in the kitchen, while Mabel sat with the sleeping Ruth, and outside the winter dark pressed against the window and the fire in the kitchen stove ticked softly. It was a small thing washing dishes, but it had a domesticity to it that he felt acutely in the narrow space of the kitchen, the two of them moving around each other with an ease that felt earned rather than assumed. She handed him the plates to dry. He stacked them on the shelf. Their hands brushed once over the edge of a pot, and neither of them made anything of it, but neither of them moved away quickly either. "Mabel told me about your arrangement with her," Joe said, rinsing a cup. "About the deed. She told you the details. She told me the general shape of it, that you'd agreed to work the property for a year and she'd give you land at the end of it." Joe glanced at him sideways. "She says you're the best worker she's had on this land since Clarence." He felt something warm move through him at that. "She told you that?" "She told grandmother. Was in the room." Joe's expression was carefully neutral, though the corners of her eyes did something that suggested amusement. "Mabel doesn't give compliments carelessly." "No," he agreed. "She doesn't." They finished the dishes. Joe dried her hands on the flour sack towel hanging from the oven handle and looked at him directly in the way she had without coyness or deflection. "She also said she thinks you're a good man," Joe said. "Which, again, Mabel does not say about people she doesn't mean it about." He held that for a moment, uncertain what to do with it. "She's a remarkable woman," he said. "She is," Joe agreed. "She's one of the best people I've ever known, actually. She and grandmother have been friends for 25 years. After grandmother's husband died, Mabel was the person who kept her company through the worst of it. Just showed up and stayed for weeks. Brought food. Talked when talking was needed. Was quiet when quiet was needed." Joe folded the towel over the oven handle again with a neat precision. "Think that's a rare thing, knowing which one someone needs." He thought about sitting through the storm. He thought about Mabel opening her door to a wet stranger without hesitation, without calculation, from a straightforward sense of how people ought to behave toward each other. He thought that what Joe had just described, the knowing which one someone needs, was perhaps the exact quality that made Mabel Hart extraordinary. "It is rare," he said. Their eyes held for a moment, and then they both looked elsewhere. By some mutual unspoken agreement that they had arrived somewhere that required more time to navigate than Christmas evening in someone else's kitchen allowed. January was brutal. The Wyoming winter arrived in its full authority, and Lee spent those weeks maintaining the property through conditions that tested everything he had learned about cold weather work on the trail. The stock needed constant attention. The water troughs needed breaking every morning. The paths needed clearing after each snowfall. He moved through the short, frozen days with a focused productivity that kept the cold at bay and left him genuinely tired enough to sleep without difficulty. He still went north to the Callister property twice a week. He told himself this was because Ruth Callister was unwell, and it was right to check on their neighbors. Both things were true. There was also a third truth that he was less comfortable examining directly. Joe had begun to teach herself to bake bread. She had made biscuits and cakes in Missouri, she explained, but proper bread had always been her grandmother's domain, and Ruth's hands were now too painful with rheumatism to manage the kneading. Ellie arrived one January morning to find her covered in flour, triumphant over a loaf that had risen beautifully and was now cooling on the rack, and the expression on her face, purely delighted at the simple achievement of it, did something to his composure that he hadn't been braced for. "Look at that," she said, turning the loaf on the rack to admire it from different angles. "It's a good loaf," he said. "It's a perfect loaf." She glanced at him with that sideways smile. "The last three were not perfect loaves. This one is." He stayed for the bread, which they ate warm with butter in Ruth's kitchen while Ruth dozed in the next room and the winter light moved slowly across the floor. Joe told him about Missouri, about the family farm outside St. Louis, about her parents who still worked it, about 3 younger siblings who were presumably growing up in the years she had been away. She had come to Wyoming not only for Ruth, she explained, but also because she had been wanting a reason to go somewhere new, and caring for her grandmother had been a good and true reason rather than a manufactured one. "Did you like Missouri?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I liked the people in it," she said. "I liked the farm and the seasons. But I always had the feeling that there was more of the world than what I was seeing from one place, and I wanted to know what the more looked like." "And what does it look like?" he asked. "Wyoming." She looked out the frosted window at the winter landscape, the white fields and the dark line of cottonwoods along the creek, the sky a hard, bright blue above it all. "Like something that doesn't apologize for itself," she said, and he understood exactly what she meant. In February, Alden Crow came himself. He arrived on a cold morning in a good coat on a very good horse, with 2 men riding at a respectful distance behind him. He was perhaps 50, well-fed, with a politician's face, smooth and confident, and practiced at projecting reasonableness. Ellie saw him coming from the south field and walked to meet him at the gate with a deliberate unhurriedness. Crow smiled when he reached the gate. The smile was practiced and not unpleasant. "Fine morning," he said. "Illy Calloway, isn't it? I'm Alden Crow." "I know who you are," Illy said. Crow took this without visible offense, which told Illy he was used to it. "I'm here to speak with Mrs. Hart about a business matter, a purchase offer." "Mrs. Hart isn't interested in selling," Illy said. "I'd like to hear that from Mrs. Hart herself, if you don't mind." The smooth voice was perfectly reasonable. "I do mind, actually," Illy said. "Mrs. Hart has made her position clear through her representative on 2 previous occasions, and she doesn't wish to repeat herself." A flicker of something moved through Crow's composed expression, not anger, but something that was the parent of anger, disciplined and waiting. "Her representative," he said. "Yes." Crow looked at the fence line, at the barn, at the house with its smoke rising from the chimney in the still winter air. He looked at Illy with an assessment that was calibrated and thorough. "The Hart property is valuable," he said. "I'm prepared to make a very generous offer. More than fair market value. Mrs. Hart is an elderly woman alone. The winters here are hard. It seems to me that a comfortable situation elsewhere, with sufficient funds to provide for herself properly, might be considerably more appealing than Mrs. Hart is not alone," Illy said. "She has a properly recorded arrangement with a working occupant of this property, copies of which are on file with the county recorder in Laramie. She has a lawyer in Laramie who is familiar with her situation and her wishes, and she has neighbors who watch out for her." He let a brief pause develop. "With respect, Mr. Crow, there's nothing here for your company. This property isn't going to become available." Crow held his gaze for a long moment. The 2 men behind him were still and quiet. Then Crow touched the brim of his hat in a courtesy that had nothing warm in it. "Calloway," he said, "I'll remember you." "I would expect so," Illy said. Crow turned his horse and rode south, the 2 men following at their careful distance. Illy stood at the gate until they were out of sight, and then he stood a moment longer until his heart rate settled back to something ordinary. When he went inside, Mabel was at the kitchen table with her coffee, as though she had not just been watching through the window. "He came," she said. "He came," Illy confirmed. She looked at him. "How did it go?" "He left," Illy said. "He sat down at the table. He's not done, though. Men like that aren't done after one polite conversation." "No," Mabel agreed. "But they calculate costs and benefits. You've made this property more complicated than it was when I was here alone. That changes the calculation." She poured him a cup of coffee. "Well done, Illy." He accepted the cup. "I don't think he's the kind of man who stays discouraged," he said carefully. "No, but he's the kind of man who has a great many properties on his mind at once. If this one becomes too complicated, he moves on to the next and comes back to this one when the circumstances seem easier." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "We need to make sure the circumstances never seem easier." It was in this spirit that Mabel, in March, did something that both surprised and clarified everything for Illy in a single, quiet afternoon. She called him in from the field mid-morning, which was not her habit. She was sitting at the table with the wooden box open in front of her, and on the table beside the box was the deed, unfolded, and next to it, a new document that had the unmistakable look of something recently drawn up by Henderson, the lawyer. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I've been thinking," she said. "The agreement we made in October gave you 40 acres at year's end and the right of first purchase on the remainder. That was a good arrangement for October." She looked at the deed. "But it's March now, and I've had time to observe several things. One is that you're the finest worker this land has had since Clarence was young. Two is that you care about this property in the way I hoped someone would, but hadn't been sure anyone would. And three," she paused with a precision that suggested the third thing was the one she had thought about the most. "Three is that I'm 74 years old and the winter was hard on my joints, and I think it's time to think about the long term rather than the comfortable middle term." Ellie waited. "I want to change the arrangement," she said. "Not to your disadvantage. To your advantage, in fact, and in a way that also does what I need it to do." She slid the new document across the table. "Henderson drafted this. Read it." He read it. It took him several minutes. It was more complex than the original agreement, and his reading was careful. When he finished, he looked up at her. "Mabel," he said, "this is the whole property. Yes, all 240 acres, not just the 40 at year's end. Yes. You're changing the agreement to deed me the entire property at the end of the year, not at the end of some subsequent purchase process. With one condition," she said. He looked back at the document. He found the condition on the second page. The condition was that the property must remain in active use and not be sold for a period of 20 years from the date of transfer, and that if Ellie died without heirs within that period, the property would revert to whatever charitable institution Mabel designated. "There's a second part to the condition," Mabel said, "which isn't in the document because it isn't the sort of thing you put in legal documents, but I want to say it plainly." He waited. "I would like to live on this property for the rest of my life," she said. "Not as a burden, not as someone to be managed. I'm not foolish enough to think I have unlimited years left, but I have some, and I want to spend them here. The document doesn't require you to accommodate me, because a document can't create that kind of goodwill. But I'm asking you directly, if I deed you this property, will you let me stay?" He felt the fullness of what she had just asked settle over him. All of it, the trust implicit in it, the vulnerability of an old woman asking a man she had known for 5 months to promise her something that he didn't need to promise, because the document didn't require it. "Mabel," he said, "there is no version of this where you don't stay. This is your home. It was your husband's home. This will always be your home for as long as you want it to be." She looked at him for a long moment. Her blue eyes were very clear and very still. "Good," she said, and then, in a voice that was the quietest he had heard from her, "Clarence would have liked you." He signed the new document. Mabel signed it, and Henderson's copies were filed the following week. The spring came in like something that had been waiting to be believed in all through the long, cold months. The creek rose with snowmelt and ran quick and brilliant over its stones, and the cottonwoods put out their first pale green, and the south field turned black and rich under Ellie's plow, and seemed to breathe when the sun came to it in the mornings. He found himself awake early not from duty but from simple eagerness, which was something he had not felt in years, and which had a specific joy attached to it that he was careful not to take for granted. He pruned the apple trees, the ones planted by Josephine Delacroix, who had cried when she left this land, and whom he thought about as he worked among the branches, understanding in a new way what it was to invest yourself into a place and then be separated from it. He pruned them with care, and they would bloom that spring in a way Mabel said she hadn't seen since Josephine's time. And there was something in that continuity, the Delacroix woman's love for the land preserved in root and branch, continuing to produce even after she was gone, that struck him as one of the more hopeful things he had encountered. And in the spring, things between Ellie and Joe became something he could no longer pretend were casually neighborly. It started, as most real things do in an ordinary moment. He had ridden north on a Wednesday in early April, ostensibly to bring Ruth Callister a pot of Mabel's early garden vegetables, actually because he was increasingly incapable of going more than 3 days without seeing Joe. He arrived to find Ruth in better spirits than she had been all winter. The warmth was helping her joints, and Joe in the kitchen garden, kneeling in the dirt with her hands in the earth, pressing seeds into the turned soil with a focused tenderness that stopped him short at the garden gate. She looked up and saw him there and did not say anything for a moment. The afternoon light was warm and clear, and the garden smelled of turned earth and early things, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, a meadowlark was performing with considerable enthusiasm. "I was going to ride over later," she said. "I wanted to bring Mabel some of Grandmother's seedling starts for her kitchen garden." "She'll appreciate that," he said. He opened the gate and came in and knelt down near her without entirely deciding to. The dirt was dark and good. "What are you planting?" "Beans and squash at this end. Tomatoes nearer the fence where they'll get the south wall warmth. Carrots down the middle." She pressed another seed into a small hole and covered it with a deft movement of her thumb. "Grandmother says the soil here is better than Missouri for growing things, and I didn't believe her until last summer, but she's right." He picked up a handful of the soil and held it in his palm, the way you do when you're checking what's there. It was good, dark and loose with adequate moisture, warming now in the spring sun. "It's good earth," he agreed. They worked the garden together for a while, him helping her with the rows while she directed, since it was her garden and she knew what was going where. It was simple and physical and entirely pleasant, and at some point the conversation shifted from garden logistics to other things, as it always did with them, and they talked about what the summer would look like, and what the territory might be like in 5 years, and whether Wyoming would make its case for statehood soon. And all the while the meadowlark continued its performance, and the afternoon light turned slowly golden, and neither of them noticed the time in any productive way. When he finally stood and dusted his hands and said he should get back before dark, she stood too and brushed the dirt from her dress and looked at him with a directness that was very Joe. No preparation, no staging. "Illy," she said. "Yes. I'd like it if you came to see me instead of always finding a reason to come see Grandmother." A pause, steady and without apology. "I know that's forward, but I'd rather say it than not and spend the summer wondering." He looked at her in the spring evening, the garden they had planted together, the Callister homestead behind her, the cottonwoods, the pale sky above the western ridge going amber at the edges. He thought about all the times he had found a reason, and known while finding it that it was a reason rather than the actual reason. "Yes," he said, "I would like that too." They stood there for a moment in the garden, both of them smiling slightly and not quite looking directly at each other, and then looking, and it was as close to perfect as an April evening in Wyoming could be. He rode home in the golden hour with a feeling in his chest like something expanding that had been compressed for a long time, and when he came back into the barn and began to unsaddle Jasper, the gelding turned his head and regarded him with his usual calm intelligence, and Ellie said to him, simply, "Joe Callister," as though the name by itself contained everything that needed saying. Jasper appeared to find this acceptable. The courtship, if you could call it that, which Mabel did, without embarrassment, and frequently proceeded through the spring with a naturalness that surprised Illy, because he had not previously understood that such things could be natural. He had thought from his limited experience of these matters that they were necessarily awkward and uncertain, full of wrong moves and misread moments. But with Joe, it was like the work of the farm, purposeful and clear, with an underlying rightness that made the effort feel like expression rather than labor. They rode together on Sunday afternoons, which became a fixed thing before either of them formally proposed that it be. They rode out to the edges of the valley and along the creek and up into the lower reaches of the foothills where the pine trees began and the air was different, cool and sharp and full of bird call. They talked constantly on these rides, the conversation running easily from subject to subject, the way good water moves through good country, finding its own level, never forcing. He told her about the cattle drives in detail, not the cleaned-up version he gave to strangers, but the actual experience, the exhaustion and the weather and the particular monotony of days that are all physically demanding and emotionally identical, and also the specific beauty of the open country as seen from the back of a horse in a good season. She told him about her family in Missouri, her father, who was a quiet and methodical man who grew corn and had a gentle way with his horses, and her mother, who was the louder and more decisive of the two, and who had taught Joe to read at 4 years old, because she believed that there was no good argument for waiting. She told him about her younger brothers, Sam and Walter, who were 16 and 14 and probably in trouble of some variety at this very moment, she said with affectionate certainty. And she told him about the winter she had spent nursing her youngest sister, Nan, through a serious illness at the age of 15, and how that winter had taught her what she was made of and what she was not, and that she had never been the same after it in the ways that mattered. "You're not afraid of difficult things," he observed one afternoon, watching her navigate grandmother's mare along a rocky creek crossing with easy competence. She considered this. "I'm afraid of them," she said. "I just try not to let the being afraid make the decision for me." He thought this was one of the best things he had ever heard, and he thought it frequently afterward. In May, Mabel took a short illness, nothing life-threatening, a respiratory complaint brought on by a late cold snap, and spent a week largely confined to the house. And during that week, Ellie managed both the farm and the household, cooking and doing the indoor tasks alongside the outdoor ones. And Joe came over every other day and helped, and the three of them had a particular closeness during that week that was both born of necessity and something more than that. On the 4th day of the illness, Mabel was sitting up in her bed looking considerably better but maintaining, Ellie suspected, a degree of incapacitation beyond what she strictly required, and he brought her morning coffee and found Joe already there, sitting in the bedside chair reading aloud from a novel. Mabel, he noticed, had a very satisfied expression on her face. "You're enjoying this," he said. "The book is very good," Mabel said, with a serenity that did not fool him for a moment. Joe continued reading without looking up, but the corners of her eyes crinkled. "You arranged this," he said. "I had a respiratory complaint," Mabel said. "That is a medical fact." "A medically convenient fact," he said. Mabel lifted her coffee cup and regarded him over the rim with those blue eyes that gave nothing away and gave away everything. "The South Orchard fence needs attention," she said. "You should probably take someone with you to help manage the wire." He looked at Joe. Joe folded down the page of the book and stood. "I know how to handle fence wire," she said. "I know you do," he said. They did fix the South Orchard fence, which genuinely needed fixing. And they talked while they worked, and at some point in the warm May afternoon, with the apple trees in full bloom around them and the air sweet with blossom, he set down the wire stretcher and turned to her and said, without planning it, without any strategy, "Joe, think I'm in love with you." The words surprised him on the way out, but not because they weren't true. They were completely true. They had been building toward truth for months and had simply arrived without asking for his permission. Joe looked at him. The orchard was brilliant around her. The blossoms were from Josephine Delacroix's trees, which had survived the years and the winters and the changes of ownership to keep producing their beauty on the spring air. And Ellie thought, not for the first time, that love in a place accumulates the way good soil accumulates slowly, over years, through everything that happens to it. "I know," Joe said simply. And then, "I think I'm in love with you too." He crossed the few feet of grass between them and took her hands in his, her strong, work-calloused, practical, wonderful hands, and looked at her in the flowering orchard and the afternoon sun. And she looked back at him with those hazel eyes that changed light into warmth. And then he kissed her for the first time, and the world reorganized itself slightly around that fact, the way worlds do when things of significance occur. Mabel, when they came back from the fence with the news that it was repaired, and possibly also with news of a different kind that was evident in the way they were not quite looking at each other and were obviously very happy, made no comment other than to say that supper was nearly ready and would Joe be staying. Joe stayed. Later, after supper, when Ellie had gone out to see to the animals and Joe was helping Mabel with the dishes, Mabel said, with her characteristic directness, "He's a good man, Josephine." "I know," Joe said. "Not many of them about," Mabel said. "I mean truly good, not just competent or reliable, though he is both of those. I mean the kind of good that is part of the character rather than a performance of it." Joe set a plate carefully on the shelf. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since December," Mabel said, without apology. "A woman with her wits about her plans ahead." Joe laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, and turned to look at the old woman she had loved since childhood, who had weathered 31 Wyoming winters and raised children, and lost a daughter and buried a husband, and stood firm against every pressure that tried to move her from her land, and who had, apparently, also decided in December to provide circumstances favorable to two people who hadn't quite caught up with themselves yet. "Thank you," Joe said. Mabel waved a hand. "Thank me by being happy. It costs nothing and it's worth everything." The summer unfolded in the way of good summers, full of work and warmth and the particular satisfaction of a productive place. The south field produced well. The kitchen garden was abundant. The apple trees, pruned and tended, set a heavy crop of fruit that they would spend October putting up in preserves and dried slices. Ellie worked the property with an energy that was half industry and half love, because the land was his now in the deep sense, not just legally, but in the way that a place becomes part of you when you have put your body and attention into it through multiple seasons. Joe came to the property 3 and 4 times a week. She helped Mabel with the kitchen garden and the preserving, and she and Ellie rode out on Sunday afternoons still, though the rides now had a different quality, easier, more certain, warmed by the knowledge of what they were to each other. Sometimes they rode out at evening and watched the sun go down behind the western ridge, the sky going through its extraordinary western theater of color, amber and rose, and a specific shade of gold that had no name in any language Ellie knew, and they sat their horses side by side, and said very little and were very happy. He proposed to her on the 1st of August, on a ridge above the valley, with the evening sky doing its considerable best behind him. He had thought about how to say it and had eventually decided to say it simply, because Joe was the kind of person for whom simplicity was the best proof of sincerity. "Josephine Callister," he said, "I want to spend my life with you. I want to build something here that's worth building, and I want to build it with you. Will you marry me?" Joe looked at him in the evening light. She had known it was coming, he could tell from the quality of her stillness, but she received it with her full attention anyway, not rushing past it. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Ellie Calloway." He had no ring, he told her this honestly, saying that he wanted her to have a say in it rather than presenting her with something chosen alone. She told him she didn't need a ring. He said he wanted her to have one anyway. They agreed on this small point and moved on to the larger fact, which was that they were going to be married, and the evening sky seemed entirely supportive of the decision. They were married in September of 1883 in a small ceremony in the Callister yard, with Ruth Callister and Mabel Hart as witnesses, and a traveling minister named Reverend Mac Creddy presiding, a rangy man with a kind face who knew the territory, and asked very sensible questions about the couple before the ceremony in the way of someone who takes marriage seriously rather than performing it. Mabel sat in the best chair, which had been carried from the house and placed on the Callister porch, with the aspect of someone who has engineered something and is satisfied with the result. Ruth sat beside her in her own chair, wrapped in a shawl against the September morning, her rheumatic hands folded in her lap, her face open with happiness. Jo wore her best dress dove gray with ivory trim and had her hair down, which Ellie had never seen before, and he thought for a moment when she came out that the morning had become something different from anything that had preceded it. He wore his good coat and had borrowed a proper collar from the mercantile owner in Miller's Crossing, who had lent it without requiring an explanation once the reason was apparent. Reverend Mac Creddy read from the appropriate scripture and asked them the appropriate questions, and they answered them with a sincerity that had nothing performed about it. Because there was nothing to perform, they meant every word, and everyone present knew it. Ellie put the ring on Joe's finger, a simple gold band he had ridden to Laramie to acquire, with Henderson, the lawyer's help in locating a reliable jeweler. Joe held it up in the September morning light and looked at it with a particular expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. Not theatrical delight, but a quiet, complete happiness, the kind that goes all the way down. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Mac Creddy said, and Ellie kissed his wife in the Callister yard with the cottonwoods golden in the early fall and Mabel making no comment whatsoever, but smiling in a way that reorganized her entire face. Ruth Callister wept, which was appropriate and lovely. The reception was a small supper that Joe and Mabel had prepared together, and Mac Creddy stayed and ate and told 3 very good stories about his travels through the territory. And as the evening came on and the stars appeared one by one in the Wyoming sky, Ellie sat with his wife and their 2 old women and the traveling minister and was, for the first time in as long as he could clearly remember, precisely where he wanted to be in the world. He and Joe settled into the Hart property, their property now, though both of them thought of it as Mabel's in the ways that mattered with a naturalness that felt like the completion of something that had begun the night of the storm the previous October. Joe moved her belongings from the Callister house and arranged them in the main room with a thoughtful care that brought new life to the space, and she and Ellie lived in the main house while Mabel, who insisted she was perfectly fine and would tell them if she was not, remained in her bedroom off the kitchen that had been hers and Clarence's for 30 years. It was, by any standard of the time and place, an unusual domestic arrangement. It was also, by any honest assessment, a very good one. Mabel and Joe had a relationship that was neither grandmother and granddaughter nor mother and daughter, but something that drew on both without being exactly either a friendship between women of very different ages that had its own authority and warmth. They cooked together. They gardened together. They argued with considerable pleasure about the novels they were both reading and the proper method of putting up apple preserves, and the question of whether Wyoming would achieve statehood before the decade was out, an argument in which both of them held strong positions and neither of them gave much ground. Ellie worked the farm through the autumn with Joe often working alongside him, and this was different from working alone, not easier, necessarily, but richer. Having someone who understood the work and could do it alongside you changed the quality of the days in ways he had not predicted. Alden Crow appeared one more time, in October, with a different man, this time a lawyer rather than a writer, which suggested an adjusted strategy. The lawyer presented a written offer for the property, correctly addressed this time to Ellie Calloway rather than Mrs. Hart, and correctly acknowledging the recorded ownership change. The offer was, as Crow had said, more than fair market value. Ellie read it carefully, thanked the lawyer for his time, and handed it back. "Tell Mr. Crow that this property is not for sale," he said, "at any price. And tell him that we appreciate his interest, but we'd prefer he redirect it to properties whose owners might want to sell, because our position on this one is not going to change." The lawyer left. Crow, to his credit, did not come again, whether because he had moved on to easier acquisitions or because he had decided that Ellie Calloway was simply not going to be budged. They could not know. Either way, the valley remained what it was, their valley, with its creek and its cottonwoods and its south field and its apple orchard, and it's one old woman in a bedroom off the kitchen who made her opinions known on all subjects, and was exactly where she wanted to be. The winter of 1883 was hard, but they went through it well. They were three people in a warm house with adequate wood and adequate food and adequate company, and there is much to be said for being three people in a warm house in a Wyoming winter when you have all of those things. Mabel's health was better than the previous winter. She said the company helped, in a voice that suggested she was stating a medical fact rather than anything sentimental. Ruth Callister declined through the winter, which was sad and was expected, and was handled with the dignity that Ruth had always brought to her life. Jo rode north frequently to be with her grandmother, and Ellie went with her often, and they sat with Ruth and talked and read to her in the evenings. And Ruth told stories about the early days of her life on the territory that were extraordinary, the things she had witnessed, the changes she had seen move through the landscape like weather, the people she had known who were part of the fabric of the place. Ruth passed in February of 1884, gently and at home, with Jo holding her hand. It was a clean and honest death, the kind that a long and honest life earns, and Jo grieved it with a directness that was very much her fully, without minimizing it. And then, over the weeks that followed, with a deliberate turning toward the living. Mabel was the one who understood best what to say and when to say nothing, which did not surprise Ellie at all. The Callister property, with no other heirs, passed through Ruth's will to Jo, who after some consideration decided to sell it to a young family named the Pattersons, who had arrived from the east looking to homestead, and who struck Jo and Ellie both as good and capable people who would use the land well. The sale was made at a fair price, and the proceeds put toward improvements on the Hart-Callaway property, new equipment for the south field, a proper extension on the barn, and the beginning of a second apple orchard on the east slope of the valley. Spring of 1884 brought the news that Jo was expecting their first child, which she announced to Ellie one morning in April over breakfast with the same directness. She brought to everything simply stated, with her eyes on his face to see how he received it. He received it by sitting very still for a moment, and then getting up from the table and coming around to her, and taking her face in his hands and kissing her forehead and her cheek and then her mouth, and she put her hands over his and laughed, and from the bedroom down the hall Mabel's voice said, "I heard that," with a satisfaction that suggested she had been waiting for it. "You have very good hearing," Ellie called. "I have very appropriate hearing," Mabel replied, and they heard her get up from her bed with the careful movements of an early morning and come to the kitchen, and when she appeared in the doorway she looked at them both with those clear blue eyes and said, "Good. This house needs more people in it." Their son was born in November of 1884, a large and healthy boy who arrived with considerable personal drama, and then immediately settled into a composed and interested examination of his new circumstances, which Ellie thought was entirely characteristic of someone who was half Jo. They named him Clarence Joseph Callaway Clarence for Mabel's husband, who had built this place and loved it, and Joseph for Jo's father in Missouri, who wept when he received the letter and wrote back 6 pages that arrived in January and made Jo laugh and cry in equal measure. Mabel held young Clarence on the first full day of his life with a steadiness that belied her age and a tenderness that was private and complete. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "He has good hands." This was, coming from Mabel, a significant pronouncement. Young Clarence grew through his first year in the company of a grandmother who was not quite his grandmother and a great-grandmother of sorts in Mabel, who was now 76 and moving more slowly but no less purposefully through her days. He was a cheerful and observant infant who showed early signs of his mother's directness and his father's quietness, a combination that seemed promising. When Clarence was 14 months old and beginning to pull himself up against the furniture, with the concentrated determination of a young person who has decided that the floor is beneath his capabilities. Joe told Ellie one evening by the fire that she thought they might be expecting again. They were. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1886, in May, when the apple trees were in bloom and the valley was at its most extravagant. They named her Clara for Mabel's daughter who had died at 9, with Mabel's permission asked and given with a brevity and gravity that meant everything, and me for Joe's mother in Missouri. Clara arrived in the world with a decisive quality that immediately distinguished her from her brother's composed examination, and she spent her first hours making her preferences about her circumstances absolutely clear to everyone in the house. Mabel said, "She's going to be remarkable," Joe said. "She's going to be terrifying." Ellie looked at his daughter and thought she was both of these things and that the combination was excellent. The valley settled into the years with a richness that Ellie found himself sometimes stopping to actively notice, not taking for granted, but standing in the middle of his days and consciously apprehending the fullness of what was there. The south field in summer, heavy with grain. The apple orchard in fall, the branches bent under their load. Young Clarence running between the trees on a September afternoon with Joe's laugh on his face. Clara, who at 2 was already showing a particular stubbornness about the direction she intended to move in, and who regarded the chickens with a proprietary interest that suggested she had plans for them. And Mabel Hart, who was 78 and whose movements were slower now and whose hands shook sometimes, but whose eyes were as clear and sharp as they had ever been, and whose opinions were delivered with undiminished precision. She sat on the porch in the summer evenings and watched the valley and told Ellie and Joe things about this land that only 35 years of continuous attention could have produced, which slopes dried out first in a dry year, where the frost came earliest in fall, which section of the creek was most reliable in a drought summer. She told these things slowly and deliberately, in the way of someone making sure they are heard, because she knew and they knew that there is a finite amount of time for one person to give what they know to another, and every such transmission is a form of inheritance. In the summer of 1887, on a warm evening in July, Mabel did not come to supper. This had never happened before. Joe found her in her chair by the bedroom window, looking out at the valley in the long summer light. She was not in distress. She was simply resting, she said, and told Joe to go back to supper. She would be along. She did not come along. Ellie and Joe ate with the children and cleaned up and put the children to bed, and Joe went to check on Mabel and came back to the kitchen with an expression on her face that he read immediately. They sat with Mabel through that evening, both of them, in the chair by the window. She drifted in and out of wakefulness and sometimes talked about Clarence, about Clara who had died, about the early years in the valley when everything was new and hard and full of possibility, about the night of the storm in October of 1882 when a wet stranger had knocked on her door. She smiled when she said this. He held her hand. "You turned out well," she said to him at one point with all the dry precision of her best self. "You gave me a place to turn out in," he said. Her eyes opened fully at that and found his face, clear and steady for one long moment. "Yes," she said. "That's right. That's exactly right." She died before morning, quietly in her own bed, in the house she had come to in 1851 as a young woman from Pennsylvania, in the valley she and Clarence had made into something worth loving, and which she had trusted to people who would love it after her. She was 79 years old. They buried her beside Clarence on the small rise behind the house where he had been buried in 1871, beneath a stone that Ellie had carved through several cold evenings in the barn with tools borrowed from the miller in Copperfield. The stone said, "Mabel Hart, 1808-1887. She stayed." That was what Joe had decided should be written. Ellie thought it was perfect. Young Clarence, who was not quite 3, attended the burial with a solemnity that his parents had not coached him in, as though he understood through some simple instinct what the occasion called for. He put a single wild daisy on the mound of turned earth with a deliberateness that made both his parents look away for a moment to compose themselves. Clara, at 14 months, sat on Joe's hip and regarded the proceedings with her usual proprietary attention, as though filing information for future reference. The autumn of 1887 was one of the most productive the valley had seen. The apple crop was extraordinary. They filled every jar they had with preserves and dried enough slices to last through 2 winters. And Lee took 3 wagon loads to sell in Laramie and Copperfield, and came back with enough money to buy the additional equipment for the east orchard that had been on his list for a year. The south field had produced as well as ever, and the cattle they now kept a small herd of 12, enough for their own use, and a modest sale of beef were fat going into winter. He stood in the apple orchard one October evening as the sun went down, Mabel's orchard, Josephine Delacroix's orchard, and thought about the chain of care that ran through the place, all the hands that had worked the soil and the trees, all the attention and intention that had accumulated in the land over the years, all the love that had been given to this valley by people who had believed it was worth giving love to. It moved through him like something physical. Joe found him there. She came out from the house and walked through the orchard to where he was standing, and she stood beside him and looked out at the valley in the failing light. "I miss her," she said. "Yes," he said. "I do too." They stood together in the orchard for a while. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone full gold and were beginning to release their leaves in the small evening wind, a steady, slow, golden fall that caught the last light and let it go. "She knew," Joe said. "When she gave you that deed, she knew what she was giving you." "She knew more than the deed," Ellie said. Joe looked at him. He looked at her. "She knew she was giving you a future," Joe said. "She just didn't know all the pieces of it yet." He thought about that October storm. The shelter of the lean-to, the light in the window, the door opening to reveal a small, fierce old woman who saw a wet stranger and said, "Get inside." The wooden box. The document folded carefully inside it. The condition that had not needed to be written down because some obligations run deeper than law. He thought about how a single night had contained, without his knowledge, the full shape of everything that had followed the land, the work, the argument with Crow at the fence line, the winter evenings by the fire, the December orchard and the summer proposal and the September wedding and the morning Joe had told him across the breakfast table about Clarence, and then Clara, and the years of the valley opening out before them like exactly what it was. He took Joe's hand. She folded her fingers through his. "She gave us everything," he said. "Just sat with me through a storm and gave us everything." Above them, the first stars were appearing in the Wyoming sky, clear and cold and steady. The creek made its sound in the near dark. The valley settled into its evening self, familiar and full, the kind of full that only comes when a place has been loved for a long time and will continue to be loved for a long time after that. They went in. The house was warm. The children were asleep. The fire was banked for the evening. On the shelf beside the fireplace, where Mabel's wooden box had once sat, there was now a collection of objects. The box itself, kept there in permanence, a small framed daguerreotype of Mabel and Clarence from some unrecorded year. A book of Tennyson that was now held together largely by sentiment and one piece of twine, and beside it, placed there by Joe sometime in the months after Clara's birth, a small jar of dried apple slices from the first year of the orchard, labeled in Joe's neat hand, "Josephine's trees, our harvest." Ellie looked at the shelf for a moment before he went to bed, the way he often did. He looked at the box that held the deed to this land, to this future that a storm had delivered to him in the person of an old woman who had opened her door and made room. He looked at Tennyson. He looked at the little jar of apple slices and thought about the orchard and the labor of all the years and the continuing faithfulness of the trees. He went to bed. Joe was already there, reading by the lamp Dickens again, the third time through Bleak House, which she claimed kept improving. He got in beside her and she leaned against him without looking up from the page, and he lay there in the lamplight and listened to the house settle around them, the sound of the fire dropping to coals, the distant sound of cattle shifting in the barn, the creek, always the creek, and somewhere in the cottonwoods the wind moving through the high branches in a way that was not quite a sound but more of a presence. He was asleep before she finished her chapter. Outside, the valley was dark and still and full of stars. The orchard was bare-branched for winter but not finished, never finished, just resting, waiting for the spring that would always come. On the rise behind the house, the two stones stood as they had stood, Clarence's for 16 years and Mabel's for not yet one, both of them settling into the permanence of the place. The deed to 240 acres of good Wyoming land rested in its wooden box on the shelf by the fireplace, alongside a book of poems and a photograph, and a jar of dried apple slices. And the two people who lived on that land lay asleep in their warm house with their children sleeping down the hall, and all of it, every acre, every apple tree, every river stone in the creek bed. Every board in the barn had come from one night of storm and one old woman's open door and one cowboy's willingness to sit with her through the darkness until the weather changed. The weather always changes. That is both the difficulty of the world and the whole of its hope. In the years that followed, the valley became something. Not something grand in the way the newspapers wrote about, not a cattle empire or a land company's acquisition, or a territory politician's ambition, but something real and ongoing and full of the kind of ordinary daily life that is, looked at honestly, the actual substance of the best things in human history. Lee Calloway became known in the county as a man of his word, which was the most portable and reliable currency available, and his cattle were well regarded, and his fences were maintained, and he served 2 terms on the local water board, where he argued effectively against the kind of water rights consolidation that Alden Crow had tried to enact, and won, which was satisfying in a way that had nothing petty in it and everything principled. Joe Calloway became known as someone you could go to when a situation required someone who thought clearly and spoke plainly and did not flinch at difficult truths. She assisted in 3 difficult births in the community when no doctor was available, having learned more than was perhaps expected of her by the circuit doctor who came through twice a year. She taught a handful of children in the valley to read in the years before the territory established a proper schoolhouse, using Mabel's books and her own, and she was completely matter-of-fact about the fact that this included the children of the 2 Shoshone families who had settled in the lower valley, which some of the other families had opinions about, and which Joe absorbed with the particular quality of attention that meant she had heard them and was not going to change her position. Young Clarence grew into a boy who was thoughtful and capable with his hands, and who had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and a quality entirely his own that was hard to name, but that manifested as a general tendency to notice things other people didn't notice and to take those things seriously. He loved the orchard with a specific devotion that delighted Illy, because it suggested a continuity. The care of the trees would pass to another generation, as it had passed to Illy from Mabel, who had held it from Josephine Delacroix, and so the chain would extend forward into years that none of them could see. Clara grew into exactly what Mabel had predicted and what Joe had warned, remarkable and terrifying in equal and often simultaneous measure. She could outrode half the boys in the county by the time she was 8, a fact she established without arrogance but with a thorough consistency. She learned to read at 4, like her mother before her, and moved through every book in the house with a speed that necessitated regular trips to Laramie for more. She had decided views on most subjects and the willingness to express them, which was either a blessing or a challenge depending on your position and the day. They had a 3rd child, a boy, Henry Mabel Calloway, the middle name given without apology because Illy and Joe had discussed the matter and agreed that the name Mabel had earned a place in the next generation regardless of convention's opinion, and he arrived in the autumn of 1889, the year Wyoming achieved statehood, which seemed fitting in a way that made them both quietly happy. Wyoming became the 44th state of the Union in July of 1889, and notably became the first state to grant women the right to vote, a fact that Joe greeted with a satisfaction that was not entirely quiet, and that Ellie supported with the full conviction of a man who had spent 6 years watching his wife solve problems that would have defeated most people he knew. She registered to vote in the first territorial election. She wore her good dress, not the dove gray wedding dress, which was for special occasions of a specific kind, but her good navy blue, and she rode into Copperfield on a Tuesday in November and cast her vote and rode home again with the expression of someone who has done something that needed doing. Ellie was at the fence line when she rode back in. He looked at her from across the south field. "Well," he called. "Well," she called back and smiled, and the afternoon was full of October light. Henry grew plump and cheerful through his first year, with a temperament that split the difference between his siblings' intensities and settled into a reliable sunniness that was its own kind of gift. Mabel's grave on the rise had a small stone fence around it. Now, Ellie had built it the spring after she died, partly in tribute and partly because it seemed right that the place where she rested should be as well maintained as everything else she had cared about. And Henry, in his second year, had the habit of wandering there on warm afternoons when the gate was open and sitting quietly at the foot of the stones, which neither parent tried to redirect, because there are some conversations that happen between a child and a grave that are entirely their own affair. The valley grew, and the years grew, and the Callaway farm grew with them. The East Orchard came into production in the mid-1890 and doubled their harvest. Clarence took over the primary management of both orchards by the time he was 16, with an approach that balanced his father's thoroughness with something additionally attentive. He kept records of which varieties produced best in which years and under which conditions, and these records would eventually become the basis of a small monograph on fruit growing in Wyoming that he would write in his 30s, and that would be read in at least 3 states, though none of them knew this yet. Clara left for a teacher's college in Cheyenne at 17. She had arranged this herself, through correspondence with the institution that was as thorough and organized as anything her parents had ever produced, and returned 2 years later with a certificate and a quiet certainty about the direction she intended to move in. She established the first proper schoolhouse in the Valley community with a combination of fundraising, argument, and sheer force of personality that would have impressed even Mabel Hart. And she taught there for 30 years, and the school she built would still be standing when her grandchildren attended it, which was the kind of continuity that makes a life look like a river from above, always moving, always itself. Henry, who never lost his reliable sunniness, grew into a young man who had a gift with horses that was simply unusual, a quiet and complete communication with them, that people came from 3 counties away to see and to benefit from. He trained horses on the property through his teens and 20s, and eventually made it his life's work, and the Callaway horses became known throughout the territory in the way that the Callaway apples were known, as something that had been attended to with care and produced accordingly. Ellie worked the land through his 40s and into his 50s, with the steady attention of a man who understands that a farm is a conversation that never ends. It makes demands, and you answer them. And the quality of your answers over years is what determines the quality of what you get back. His hair went from dark to gray, and then to the particular weathered color that is not quite white but close, and the lines in his face deepened in the ways that happen when a man spends his life outdoors and looking at things that require thought. He remained straight-backed and strong well into his later years, which Joe attributed to the work and which he attributed to Joe's kitchen, and they were probably both right. Joe at 50 was very much Joe at 23, only more fully herself, more certain of her positions, less willing to use 10 words where 5 would serve, more comfortable with silence and with warmth in equal measure. Her hair had gone silver in her 30s, and she wore it with the complete indifference to vanity of someone who has better things to think about. And Ellie thought she was more beautiful at 50 than she had been at 23, which was not a polite thing he said, but a genuine fact he had observed over the accumulated evidence of the years. On a September evening in 1912, 30 years after the storm that had sent Ellie Calloway through the rain to a farmhouse in a Wyoming valley, they sat together on the porch in the last of the summer warmth. The apple orchards were heavy with fruit. The creek made its perpetual sound in the cottonwoods, which had grown tall and considerable in the decades of their tending. The south field had been turned for winter. The barn was solid and weathered, and exactly what a good barn should be. Clarence was 37 and in Laramie for the week with his wife and their 2 children, a boy and a girl whom they would see at Christmas. Clara was in her schoolhouse a half-mile along the creek, probably still there at this hour, which was entirely characteristic. Henry was in the lower pasture, working with a young horse that had come to him from a ranch in Montana, and that he had been bringing along carefully for 6 weeks. Ellie and Joe sat on the porch in the evening quiet, which was the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have long since stopped needing to fill silence. The valley lay before them in the September gold, the same valley it had always been, and also nothing like what it had been shaped by 30 years of attention and care and love. The creek still running, the trees all changed in their slow tree way. The sky above the western ridge going through its magnificent evening theater exactly as it always had and always would. Joe had her hand on his arm. She was looking at the orchard. "Mabel would like how the trees look," she said. "She'd say we've been pruning the west section too conservatively," he said. Joe laughed her real laugh, full and unguarded, the one he had loved since December of 1882 when he had first heard it in Ruth Callister's kitchen. "She would say exactly that," she said. They sat in the evening. Henry came up from the lower pasture and lifted a hand to them from the gate, and they lifted their hands back, and he went into the barn. Somewhere in the cottonwoods a bird made a sound. The creek answered it. Ellie looked at the rise behind the house where the 2 stones stood, 3 now, Ruth Callister's having been added when her Copperfield grave was moved to where Joe could tend it, and thought about the night of the storm. The porch steps, the light in the window, the door opening. A small, fierce old woman in a house cap who had seen a wet stranger and said simply, "Get inside," not knowing. That was the thing. He had not known, riding up to that farmhouse in the dark and rain, what was waiting inside it. He had not known what the wooden box held, or what the year would bring, or that standing in a December orchard in Wyoming with a woman who had hazel eyes that changed light into warmth was a thing that was going to happen to him. He had not known that he would plant orchards or raise children or defend a valley or outlast a company man's ambitions or sit on this porch in this September evening with his life complete around him in every direction. He had not known. He had only come in from the rain, and she had only opened the door. And sometimes that is all the knowing that is required, just the openness, just the willingness to let in what the storm brings, because storms are not only weather. Sometimes they are the shape of your life arriving, wet and windblown, not knowing what it carries. Joe turned to look at him in the fading September light. "Illy," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you happy?" He looked at her. He looked at the valley. He looked at the 3 stones on the rise and the trees in the orchard and the light on the creek and the barn where Henry was working with his new horse, and the road along the creek where Clara would ride home soon from her schoolhouse, and the sky above the ridge going gold and rose. "Yes," he said, "I am." She took his hand. The evening came on. The stars found the sky one by one, as they always had, as they always would, over the Calloway Valley in Wyoming, over the land that an old woman had trusted to a stranger in a storm, and that the stranger had given the rest of his life to, and that had given him, in return, everything worth having. The fire they would light inside in an hour. The supper they would make together. The sound of Henry coming in from the barn. The letter from Clarence that had come yesterday and was on the table inside, waiting to be read again. The morning that would come would always come with its work and its light and its particular version of the world's undiminished willingness to be beautiful if you had the sense to stop and look at it. All of it. Everything. A cowboy had sat with an old woman through a storm, and neither of them had known what was held between them in that wooden box, in that open door, in the simple human acts of shelter and trust and staying. And from that one night of wind and rain and firelight, a whole life had grown. It was, by every measure that mattered, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.